Phone check. 1, 2. The microphone check. 1, 2, 1, 2. The microphone check. I got my headphones tuned between two different AM stations, and my briefcase is full of declassified information. Declassified. Declassified.
Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 22nd week of 2015. For almost 25 years, this program has been a spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and when censored and locked out of there, welcomed, I'm happy to say, by the good people at Urbana Public Television. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight are Ron Szoke and David Green. Our program is produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Dan Peno. Our program's name, News from Neptune, was chosen to honor Noam Chomsky, who's been talking sense about American politics for twice the quarter century we've been on the air. Chomsky has said that the American media either repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. This and previous editions of this program are archived on YouTube and posted to the Facebook page for News from Neptune, where you'll also find comments from viewers, articles we've referred to, and further comments from us. I can be reached at carl@newsfromneptune.com, and I'm happy to receive your comments. Today is May 29th, the anniversary, 1,652 years ago, of the Battle of Ctesiphon between the armies of the Roman Empire, of the Roman Emperor Julian, and the Sassanid, that is Persian King Shapur II, outside the walls of the Persian capital Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon is about 20 miles south of modern Baghdad in Iraq. The battle was a Roman tactical victory. They held the field, although Julian was killed following the subsequent Battle of Samara. He had an appointment in Samara that he had to keep. And the Roman forces found themselves unable to continue their campaign as they were too far from their supply lines. They were in the midst of a battle between the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire, and this victory was of the sort that one more like it and they would be undone. Today, many years later, President Obama, in imitation of the Emperor Julian, is conducting war in this area against the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Islamic State, Islam in general, is the successor to the Persian Empire of the ancient world. Modern imperialism resembles ancient imperialism in interesting ways. So you're watching News from Neptune, and Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism edition, and I'll have some more to say about the archaeological remains of Julian's age a little later. But we'll go now to Ron Szoke.
Yes, I want to suggest a couple of topics which are intimately involved, I think, with the American dominance of the world and the capitalist institutions that we're living in and what it's doing to us, the causes and consequences of inequality, and the role of educational institutions in creating and perpetuating that kind of situation. The not-for-profit Corinthian colleges filed for bankruptcy after investigations into possible recruiting fraud led the Department of Education to suspend its access to federal student aid. The thousands of former students are asking the government to forgive their loans, arguing that the school used predatory practices to persuade them to borrow money. Other for-profit colleges have been accused of similar practices. Loan relief for students could cost taxpayers millions of dollars and establish a precedent for other students unhappy with their college degree who deserves debt forgiveness when for-profit colleges close or are accused of fraud. So part of the working of the system seems to be keeping everybody in debt, and we've been talking about this for a number of times now to the point where it may seem tedious. Student loan debt, medical debt, and consumer debt, because of the constant message, at least in part, we get from the advertisers that you need this, go out and buy this, and so on. And which many are people unable to do. So Paul Krugman this morning is saying a lot of people are in a position of not having any savings for their retirement. We keep hearing all of these arguments against welfare from people who are very moralistic about it, claiming that people on welfare are pulling up to stores in their Cadillacs and Lincolns and coming out with baskets full of steaks and lobster and so on.
And don't forget liquor.
Yeah, right. And when asked to provide actual verifiable evidence for this, they can't provide any. And if there are any Cadillacs and Lincolns involved, they're typically about 20 years old and so on. So it's a very bad situation up and down the scale. But rather than just continue moaning in general about the inequality and economic situation of a lot of people, let me just mention a couple of things that have been in the headlines recently and see if my colleagues want to comment on them. This business about higher education, does sending your children to college improve their economic prospects? And is that the only thing that should count in choosing whether to go to college or which college to go to? And this has come into for a lot of examination recently. So what is the point of going to college? Is it only to increase your earning power, which according to all the statistics I've seen, does significantly increase, but is that the only reason for going? I've mentioned here a couple of times, I don't think so. There are a number of other reasons. The consequences of going to college, the functionality of it in the system has not a lot to do with whether you make a whole lot of money or not, for several reasons, but that would lead off in another direction. The maintenance of the imperial system requires that people contribute in this way to a system that they know nothing of. And where this is leading us, I think, is to an erosion of all of our institutions. There are different kinds of institutions that we try to live in and support. Political, economic, cultural, and kinship institutions. And what is our economic system doing to erode, first of all, the other three, and then finally itself? This is becoming a significant talking point in a lot of places. What is increasing the cost of higher education? People think it's because tuitions are going up, and it's because there are a lot of expenses in the system for highly paid professors, and we deal with that by hiring only adjuncts and part-time people and so on, who are kept on the run trying to meet all of their obligations as low-paid teachers. What this promotes is a lower class, a proletarian class, that's constantly worried about where its money is coming from, will they be able to retire, and so on, a point touched on by Krugman today. But what some analysts are pointing to is that the increase in faculty salaries and so on, and the equipment needed to maintain a university and so on, is less of a factor than the ever greater increase in administrators. New layers of administrators are seemingly being added all the time. We saw another instance here, the currently developing situation in the University of Illinois football and women's basketball situations. The proposal immediately to deal with the situation was, well, we should hire an ombudsman to stand between the players and the coaches. Another layer of administration, and of course someone would be subordinate to the top people in the system, who are being paid enormous amounts to run these programs. Typically, the head basketball and football coach in most universities is paid far more than the president of the university, and I think we're seeing that pattern here too. So there was recently an article in the local daily, costly top posts factor in spiraling tuitions, and I think this is an unrecognized problem in higher education. There's a lot more to be said, but maybe I'd better stop here and let my colleagues have at it.
And David, I think you have some thoughts on higher education, both locally and nationally here, huh? You've been writing about it.
I read that business about hiring an ombudsman to sort of mediate student complaints.
Yeah.
And I just had to laugh. I laughed out loud when I read that, because I thought about how much business is this person. I mean, I assume they could probably give this task to somebody who already has a job, but they were actually talking about a whole new job. I don't know, who knows how this is going to play out, but it's like, wow. I mean, I don't like to rag on people who work and say that they're not earning their money, and that they're, but if there is a classic example of a feet on the desk job, that would be it. It's like, yeah, that's my job. I'm being paid $75,000 or $100,000 a year to handle complaints. I mean, if there was a big deal, obviously it would keep that person busy. Not that they're not hiring expensive lawyers whose job is to bust unions, and I don't know what busting unions has to do with dealing with the complaints of University of Illinois athletes who claim they're being physically and emotionally abused by their coaches. But that's a different story.
Lordy, what a story.
But getting back to the bigger picture, I mean, you know, what you're referring to here is just the fact that higher education is being caught up in all of the neoliberal brutality that we've been experiencing in the last 40 years. I mean, obviously the upsurge and rebellion against sort of the managerial ethic in higher ed goes back to about a little over 50 years, to the uprising at Michigan and Berkeley in the early 1960s, which quickly became combined with the protests against the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement and so forth. But everything that's happened, broadly speaking, neoliberally, has happened in a certain way on campus. And one example, of course, it isn't just that students go into debt, you know, that campuses are underfunded, expenses rise, students go into debt. It's that those loans, there was a good article on Common Dreams this week, which was originally in a good journal called Dollars and Cents, a good economics journal. I can't recall the author of it, but she talked about the securitizing of these student loans, how Sallie Mae operates, how it started out as a public thing and then has become relatively a privatized thing, how the federal government makes money on interest on student loans, but also how these are sliced and diced just the way mortgage loans were done in the subprime crisis. So everywhere you look, you find the same themes over and over. It's debt, it's Wall Street, it's who can make money off other people's suffering, and how, you know, the biggest question is how it is when capital can't find an honest way to make a buck, how does capital find a dishonest way to make a buck?
And there may be some suggestions about whether capital ever finds an honest way to make a buck. As the old man in the British Museum said, any system that depends upon the fact that the majority of the population has to sell what makes it human, that it's work of head and hands, to someone else in order to eat regularly, is already corrupt at the base, and the corruption probably can't stand. But that's a long story. This particular education situation, the present state of education, particularly higher education, as we sometimes laughingly call it, in America, deserves some attention. And I must admit, although my adult life has been spent in institutions of higher education in one form or another. I'm quite astonished at where they are now and what's happening in them. I would not have thought that when I began teaching those many years ago. But something very strange is going on in America in regard to universities, and I think that if we look at the history of universities in those years, it's pretty clear to understand. It's pretty easy to understand what's happened. First of all, look at the contrast between American universities and foreign universities. Europe and Latin America, higher education is essentially free. In many cases, including Germany, people are paid to go to the university. That is, they're giving housing allowances and food allowances, and of course, there's no tuition to attend those universities. Same is true in Latin America, even in countries that are substantially poorer than the United States, such as Mexico. Now, what's happened here? I mean, the debt structure of education in America is practically unique. American students of this generation graduate with an immense amount of debt. What's going on there? That wasn't even true, for example, for people of my generation. So something's happened in that regard, and something has happened that contrasts sharply with other countries. Student debt in this country, tuition loan debt in this country is now greater than credit card debt. That's astonishing. What's going on? Well, it seems to me that we have to understand the debt structure of American higher education as a matter of political control. You had to live through it to realize how shocked American universities were by what happened in the 60s, as we say, and into the 70s. That wasn't supposed to happen in American universities. We'd taken care of that, in the first half of the 20th century, hadn't we? Of course, students in other countries, unwashed and dangerously lefty, were involved in politics, but not in America. Not in America for some of the reasons that Ron was suggesting. This was a jobs program in American universities, and you realized that, and going to an American university guaranteed you a good job up until a few years ago. But what's happened in America, given that there is no structural reason why American higher education couldn't be free, what's happened in America, it's become extremely expensive, and that expense is a burden of debt on students to keep them quiet. This is a pacification program instituted with the rise of neoliberalism in the 70s and 80s in order to prevent what had happened in the 60s and 70s from recurring. Look, I was there, I watched it, it happened, and it worked. It's worked very nicely. Compare student reactions to the war in Southwest Asia in the last 15 years to the war in Southeast Asia from 1960 to 1975 that David referred to. So the system works. It worked quite well, thank you. And we have Pacific colleges in America when it comes to politics.
But the stresses are busting out all over. I mean, you've got what's going on in the athletic program. I mean, these things seem to be symptomatic of a very unsettled situation. I mean, you've got a lot of class tension beneath the surface with adjunct faculty members, with maintenance workers on campus. You've got students that I know we mentioned last time about students who feel like they're not respected in their classrooms because of their minority status, and all these things may be symptomatic and they may not get at fundamental issues, the issue with athletes. But then again, you've got athletes, unpaid athletes, just like, lots of money involved. And what do you ask for when you get enormous amounts of money involved in unpaid athletes? This enormous emphasis on winning, this identification of the institution with the football program or the basketball program, you're just asking for all kinds of trouble. And so, Ron, when you talk about institutions, and I've been thinking a lot about this myself, what is the responsible, how much do we ascribe individual behavior to the nature of the institution itself? Yeah. You could see, as much as, of course, people are responsible for the way they treat other people, under these circumstances, it seems to me that you can expect that there's going to be abuse, and that once you have one or two examples like this, there's going to be more popping out here or around the country.
Yeah, well, there's this cliche that's been going around actually for years that schools and colleges should be run more like a business. Or the recent version of it is they should be a business.
Yes, of course.
And we're seeing some of the consequences of that. Corinthian colleges, for example, made an enormous amount of money off of returning service people by promising them good jobs, which for the most part never materialized, and so on. And they were billing the government for a lot of this, and finally went bankrupt anyway. So it left, 16,000 people in the lurch for their higher education.
But when you have this big pot of money and you start lending it to people, then you invite these supposedly non-profit or for-profit online colleges in. What do you expect to happen? It's going to be it's got corruption and exploitation written all over it from the very start. Anybody, I mean, I'm sure plenty of people would have understood that years ago. There was just something fishy about this whole thing. Where's all this money come from? And where are the jobs that these people are supposed to get after going into debt? If people could look around and see how the economy works and how worthless a degree from an unknown online colleges, you can see the people just asking for trouble. It's like, it's like credit card debt or payday loans or anything else. If you have to go in there in the first place, you're asking for trouble.
Hey, look, it may get you a job as a state representative from the 103rd District. I mean, if you have one of these. Look, don't knock it.
Yeah,
the problem is not what's illegal.
Point taken.
The problem is not what's illegal. The problem is what is legal.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, sure, there are crooks in it. Hey, they just busted Denny Hastert, right?
Yeah. Yes,
There are plenty of crooks in the operation, but that's not the fundamental problem with the operation. I actually, David, you publicized this last week, the remarkable fact that the University of Illinois seems to have bought the services of a union-busting law firm at a rate that even shocked the News Gazette.
Yeah, well, $400+ an hour, right?
But well, look what the university is doing here. They bought a union-busting law firm to deal with these complaints arising from student athletes in the football and what is it, the women's basketball program. Now, that's really quite astonishing, and it suggests just how seriously our business university takes these complaints. This is just as bad as unions in a factory. And it makes me think that the attempt a year or two ago of the athletes at Northwestern to form a union was less froth on the wave, but a very real danger signal to the corporate university, to the neoliberal university. They looked at that and said, uh-oh, we got to nip this in the bud. This has got to be stopped now. And that's the only thing that can explain the astonishing move by the University of Illinois this week. I mean, they see how dangerous these sorts of complaints, these sorts of criticisms of the standard operating procedure of the university are to the profitability of this particular business. And they know that there are much more serious structural critiques that may be made of it. Therefore, they got to shut this up fast. They need a union-busting firm, and that's what they've done. Amazing, truly amazing.
A side note on what you were talking about, legality. From time to time, I return to and read a little bit more of David K. Johnson's Perfectly Legal, the Covert Campaign to Rig Our Tax System to Benefit the Super Rich and Cheat Everyone Else. And it's really an eye-opening book. Every time there's a movement to reform the tax code, and some commentators love to ridicule its length and complexity, what happens? What actually comes out of it is an even more one-sided tax code, favoring the rich and punishing the poor. So the blurb here from Ralph Nader says, David K. Johnson demonstrates with clear, cool, and motivating prose how the very rich need only pay their tax lawyers to make you pay for their massive illicit wealth, individual and corporate, which is impoverishing our country's necessities and swelling its deficits. This is a book that will either shame us or prod us into taking back our tax system, as if fairness, productivity, and authentic patriotism matter. And it looks to a lot of people now as if they don't really matter. It's who has the cleverest and most plugged-in tax lawyers.
And there's an important historical point here, I think, that most Americans aren't aware of, and that is the remarkable difference in tax structure and a good number of other governmental involvements with your money and mine for the last generation, I mean, for almost 40 years, and for the period immediately before that. The period that extends from the end of the Second World War into the 1970s. The benchmark of how things have changed and why the last 40 years are so different from the 40 years that went before is the average wage in the U.S. Wages in the U.S. Rose for everyone, basically, from the end of the Second World War into the 1970s. And then, quite astonishingly, they turned flat. And they have been flat ever since then. Now, that doesn't mean there are not a lot of people getting rich. There are. In fact, the concentration of wealth in the United States from the 1970s has not only increased, the concentration of wealth has not only increased, it's accelerated. It's doing it faster and faster to the day. So we speak of the 1% these days, and of course we're overestimating right there because the people with the real control of the concentration of wealth are far less than 1% of the population. But for the majority of Americans, the real difference is the period from 1970s to the present, the period of neoliberal reaction against the amelioration of the economic status of most Americans in the wake of the Great Depression. The last 40 years have been different. And this shows up in the academy. The differences in the universities of the 1960s and today that I referred to a moment ago, the differences in the political consciousness and activity of students, often ascribed to the ending of the draft by the 1973. That's really quite false. The draft was never the spur that many people thought it was, or still think it was, for the anti-war movement on college campuses in the 60s and 70s. For those who were there, you knew the draft was one of those things that could be worked around any number of ways, and that most of the people, most of the students involved in political matters in the American universities in the 60s and 70s were not subject to the draft for a variety of reasons. But once it disappeared, then it suddenly became a convenient excuse for why American universities in those days contrasted, in the days of the Southeast Asian War, contrasted so much with American universities in the Southwest during the Southwest Asian War of the last 15 years. That's not what was, I think, what was going on. But the economic structure is indeed the place to look for the differences, and the real structure of the American economy over the last generation is something that we've only slowly become aware of. The majority of Americans probably still don't know the word neoliberal, which is the term of art to describe the economic policies, the economic and social policies of both major parties since the Carter administration. That's what we're dealing with, and then we've got to call things by their right name, so to speak, in order to begin to deal with them, not only in the university, but in the society at large. You're watching News from Neptune. We have a lot of things on the table here. Comments, gentlemen?
Yeah, I'm gonna. Can I raise a new topic, or
sure. I think
continue this? Maybe, I think some of the same themes, but maybe in a more foreign policy related context. Sure. I'm going to relate two things that probably sound quite different, or maybe not. One is Jeb Bush, and the other is Adolf Eichmann. And how is it that I'm going to how is it that I'm going to fit both of these characters into the same
A
into
fat
the same
guy
topic?
and a thin guy, right?
Yeah. Well, let me just mention the Bush thing first, just to get out of the way. And this would have been appropriate when we used to do Coburns Corner. There is a phrase that has entered the lexicon the last few weeks. Hopefully, will be gone soon. Called the do-over. That we when we fight a war, that in politics and in history and in war, there's no do-overs. And this is the way Jeb Bush is sort of covering his rear end and trying to dealing with the fact that he probably well understands that his brother's war in Iraq has been an absolute failure, disaster, catastrophe, however you want to put it. But how does this relate to, and then this whole, it deserves some unpacking, as silly as it is. It deserves some unpacking, morally especially, as to what it means to admit you've done something wrong, to repair what's been done wrong, and to deal with that historically in an honest way, so that maybe there's some chance of that not happening again. And of course, there isn't any willingness. And the News Gazette also incorporated that term do-over in their management of this issue, of which of course they supported the war, and now they don't want to fess up to that. It hasn't worked out. But how does this all relate to Adolf Eichmann? Well, I don't know exactly, but I want to recommend an article in the Nation that can also be linked through to Corey Robin's website by Corey Robin about Eichmann, and specifically about Hannah Arendt, who wrote the famous book about the Eichmann trial, which she was so criticized and pilloried and ostracized for subsequent to the publication of these articles, and then this book in 1962 and 1963. Adolf Eichmann was tried in 1961 in Israel, and then executed in around this time of year, I think June of 1962. So we're observing the 53rd anniversary of that. And so, what's the deal here with Adolf Eichmann, and why Hannah Arendt was so criticized? Well, the controversy, as Robin points out, the controversy at the time had a lot to do with what she said about Jews, and what she had to say about Jewish who were kapos, who were sort of superintendents in concentration camps, and also about those Jewish leaders who saved their own skin by telling the Jewish community in places like Hungary and other places to basically give themselves up while they saved themselves, and to sort of sheepishly go to the trains that took them to the camps. That was, as Robin points out, that was the subject of the most criticism in 1962-63. Subsequently, because she was supposedly blaming the victims and calling Jews to account. There's a lot of complexity in the way she did that, but what Robin points out is that isn't discussed anymore so much because those Jews are all gone anyway. So what's left? What was the other big controversy about what Hannah Arendt wrote about Eichmann? Well, it's incorporated in her famous phrase, banality of evil, in terms of describing Eichmann as a creature of sort of bureaucratic rationality in relation to just sort of doing his job, being a good bureaucrat, being a good German, going along, and his having this rather stupid attitude rather than this rather venal attitude. And of course, it's very complex in terms of what he actually did and what Arendt actually meant. But what I think this criticism of Arendt foreshadowed was the criticism that has been with us ever since in terms of the nature of what anti-Semitism is and its role in the Holocaust. And it's become increasingly ideologically important for those who defend Israel to see German behavior as a part of what Daniel Goldhagen about 20 years ago called eliminationist anti-Semitism. And so what Robin does in this article is really explore both Eichmann and Arendt in the way that this topic should be dealt with easily, because it's this topic, anti-Semitism, and the sort of essential or non-essential nature of anti-Semitism in relation to the Holocaust, that really relates to current debates. And I think it brings us back to an understanding. And again, the question arises, and I think in this institutional framework that we're referring to, in which people behave and in which people are able to justify behavior in terms of loyalty, in a sense, or in terms of, to put it in a ridiculous modern context, in terms of being a team player, people are extremely reluctant to take responsibility for things that go wrong as long as they feel like they're following the institutional rules. And I think we see that in the present day. And people may say that I'm trivializing it by comparing Eichmann's behavior in the Holocaust to, say, something going on at the U of I or whatever, but let's put it in Jeb Bush's context. Let's put it in the context of a horrific war that we fought in Iraq, that nobody wants, that the people who perpetrated it proudly, if not proudly, proclaimed that they would do it all over again, as did Dick Cheney, of course, at least don't want to acknowledge what might have gone wrong. And I guess what I'll conclude with is by saying what impresses me about this whole aspect of the human condition, which is a name of another book by Hannah Arendt, that people think they look back and they think that if they'd have been there and they know what they knew now, they would do the right thing. Or they think that it should have been obvious that people would do the right thing if they were Germans in the 1930s. But of course, it obviously isn't that easy. Yeah. It obviously isn't so easy that people do the right thing when it comes to the state and the power of the state, the power of social pressure and institutional pressure. It's very hard to do the right thing, and I don't say that from a position of judgment, arrogance, or anything else. I don't think. I just think we need to recognize how hard it is for people who, as we learn about, the good guys and bad guys, and assume that we would have been on the side of the good guys, and cover it with this attitude of American exceptionalism, or whatever you want to call it, that there just isn't, we haven't come that far, if at all, in dealing with these issues.
Yeah. Take on this, Ron?
Yeah, well, this is a common topic in social psychology and so on. The extent to which people's behavior is governed by something within themselves, or by something in the situation that they're in. And a lot more of it is due to one's personal situation and the imperatives operating there than to some inherent part of character. It's difficult for us to admit that because we want to stay with the notion of individual moral responsibility. And that's good. That's what we should do as far as possible. We're recognizing descriptively the fact that people's behavior depends on context very largely, and the social situation that they're in, as has been shown again and again in social psychological studies of authoritarianism, obedience to authority, those kinds of things. And it's not a very pleasing diagnosis, but there it is.
The invocation of Hannah Arendt's name raises a number of themes here that may be worth mentioning, indeed some different ones from the important book, Eichmann in Jerusalem. I think the importance of that book, which began as magazine articles for the New Yorker, the importance of the book is shown by the fact that it has this sort of neuralgic quality, people keep coming back to it and worrying it, as it were, about the sorts of problems that David was talking about in connection with it. But I'd want to suggest that Hannah Arendt also has another effect, or at least a symptom or represents an aspect of American political discussion that needs analysis and has not gone away by any means. And I'm referring specifically to her larger work, more indeed meant as a more academic historical work, The Origins of Totalitarianism. This remains an interesting book to read. She in effect coined the term totalitarianism as a general description of Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia. And suggested that there were essential similarities in these two enemies of American democracy. This, at the lowest level, this picked up that good guy distinction that David just referred to, the notion that, of course, we were always the good guys, and there were a succession of really bad guys out there that shows just how much we are good guys. You could make the case pretty easily with the Nazis, and of course we had to make the case for the communists in Russia just as well, because we needed that for foreign policy purposes. First question might be raised, does the equation work? Can one really draw that sort of similarity between Nazi Germany and Stalinist Russia and the Soviet Union? The second question is, what is this category of bête noire, of serious enemy that the U.S. is always staying against in the pursuit of peace, freedom, and democracy, which, of course, that's naturally what we're doing. A more serious and more accurate description of the last couple of generations of American political history should notice that it's the domination of American capitalism from in the 20th century that leads to these conflicts with the other major states of the time, and that the differences between them on examination turn out perhaps to be less than we think. It certainly doesn't fit the black and white, good guys and bad guys scenario that's the staple of American political mythology. And remember that American political mythology is directed almost entirely to the American populace. They're the ones that the American ascendancy has to worry about, as the opposition to the Vietnam War showed. The rest of the world has a perhaps more nearly just analysis of what the U.S. is doing politically around the world, but it really doesn't matter what they think, because, of course, what happens is that the U.S. does what it wants, and the rest of the world can like it or not as it presumes to. As a result, the United States has 1,000 military bases around the world early in the 21st century, and all the other states of the world have maybe a total of 30. That's a domination that has existed since the end of the Second World War, and that the U.S. clearly intends to maintain. The rest of the world can do with it what it likes, but our politics in this country is misinterpreted by most Americans who are the objects of this intense propaganda campaign to explain how we're dealing with totalitarianism, bad guys, terrorism, have it whatever way you want, that are all somehow tied up together in that they oppose the state, indeed the class that owns the world, that is the American 1%. So we need a political theory. You need a political theory to explain why all those foreigners keep getting upset and why we have to kill them at such a great rate.
Yeah, but American corporatism seems to be spreading to other places around the world. And it's not widely understood, I think, that the purpose of having a corporate structure is precisely the avoidance of individual responsibility. That's why you form a corporation.
Right. That's a good point.
Yeah, is to avoid personal
limited
limited liability.
liability.
Yeah, yeah.
Or
And,
no liability.
Yeah, society, anime, and so on. And
And of course,
that,
it's not an American invention, nor is that unique to America. I
certainly,
mean,
yeah. Yeah, it's amusing. Gilbert and Sullivan's Utopia Limited deals with this problem and trying to solve England's imperial problems by forming corporations everywhere around the world in the colonies and so on. But I think that point is not often well enough understood, that we are so deeply sunk into this bureaucratic and corporatist mentality in many cases that it's impossible for us to imagine anything else. And it leads to this thing that you were pointing at. The sociologist Mannheim talked about, and even Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, complained about so bitterly, the lack of substantive rationality and substituting for it what's called functional rationality, how one fits into the system.
Yeah. A couple of footnotes just on the Arendt thing. I mean, I actually haven't read the book, the famous book Origins of Totalitarianism, and of course that's no big deal. There's a lot of books I haven't read, but I think the reason I haven't read that or hadn't even tried to read it, is that I so identified it with the rise of the neocons in the late 60s, early 70s, because they were always referring it to justify this, late Vietnam War, post-Vietnam War era in which the Soviet Union had to remain the mortal enemy of the United States. So I didn't know that much about Hannah Arendt, and I hadn't read the Eichmann book at that time either, and wasn't really informed on those issues. So somehow that I just got. I've known a lot more about her since, and I respect her writing, and now I'm more encouraged to read that book. But the other footnote there is that, as you may know, there's been a movie in the last couple of years made about Hannah Arendt, actually by the same woman whose name I can't recall, who made a very good movie about Rosa Luxemburg that I think her name is Trotter, Margaret.
Yes, I think that's right.
Margaret Trotter. And so she made a nice movie about Rosa Luxemburg, which you could actually view online, and then she made a movie about Hannah Arendt, which got mixed reviews. But and I haven't seen that either, so I'm obviously very behind on my Hannah Arendt, and so maybe we'll revisit. Maybe I'll watch it and read the longer book, and we'll revisit this topic at some point.
I'd like to, in the last couple of minutes here, turn to something that we teased a bit at the top of the hour. I mentioned the fact that this was the 1,652nd anniversary of the Roman victory, victory of the Emperor Julian at the Battle of Ctesiphon. Ctesiphon, the capital not far from modern Baghdad in the 4th century of the Common Era. And the parallel, as I say, to the clash of empires that the U.S. Is involved with in that region, brings us to our contemporary world, in which wars and the clash of empires are, in the wake of the Second World War, supposed to be handled by the United Nations. That was what the United Nations Charter was about at the end of the Second World War. The U.S. was so instrumental in putting together as the U.S. was rebuilding the financial and political world after the war. We might ask, why is it the case then that in the modern empire, the modern caliphate in Iraq and Syria, occupying about the region that the Sassanid Empire occupied 1,700 years ago, why the U.S. has not taken this matter to the Security Council and said, look, there's a severe threat of peace, a severe threat to peace being posed by the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS as we call it, or the Caliphate. The U.S. has chosen not to do that. It just occasionally kills some people in Iraq and Syria from the air and says, well, of course, we're doing what we can to deal with the threat to peace that comes from ISIS. But last week we had an interesting example of the way in which the debate, the discussion is structured when the ISIS forces seized the city of Palmyra in Syria. Palmyra is an ancient city, like Ctesiphon, on the Silk Road to China, and the antiquities of Palmyra were threatened by ISIS on the grounds that they represented an idolatrous religious system, and that ISIS was going to destroy these, as it had destroyed examples of other religious practices in other parts of the region that they'd seen. That caused great horror in the Western media. The U.S. saying, these barbarians, look what they're doing. You know, yes, of course, we killed 1 million people in Iraq, but these people are breaking up 2,000-year-old statues, and that something must be done, but maybe not right now, and not by the UN. I thought there was a very interesting comment from a British archaeologist and historian who has been active in the anti-war movement in Britain. This is what he said. Palmyra, one of the greatest archaeological sites in the world, is now under ISIS control. Here, I've got the wrong point. He says, iconoclasm, man's an archaeologist after all, right? Iconoclasm, the technical term for the deliberate destruction of cultural artifacts with ideological purpose. You want to break, an icon is a picture that has symbolic significance, often religious, but not exclusively. The words crept into a lot of contemporary conversation and a much more generalized sense. But iconoclasm, literally breaking a picture, is the technical term for the deliberate destruction of cultural artifacts with ideological purpose. As this scholar points out, it's not a new term. The Christians smashed the statues in Roman temples in the 5th century A.D., after Julian's time, by the way. The Catholic churches were ransacked during the Reformation. Cromwell's soldiers smashed stained glass windows during the English Revolution. Statues of Lenin were pulled down across Eastern Europe in 1989. This is the case with ISIS, which seeks to erase history, deny other cultures, and foster ignorance, bigotry, and sectarianism. The best book on the ISIS phenomenon, Patrick Coburn's account, points out the source of the ideology that drives the caliphate is not totalitarianism, it's rather Wahhabism, the extreme form of Islam that is sponsored by Saudi Arabia. But ISIS is not alone in this activity. Israeli archaeology is willfully blind to the Islamic past of Palestine, bulldozing later layers to erase the evidence of the last 1,400 years, prioritizing the excavation of material designed to legitimize the present-day Zionist occupation. At Silwan, for example, in Israel, just outside the old city of Jerusalem, Israeli archaeologists destroyed a medieval cemetery of the Abbasid Caliphate. Their aim was to create a City of David archaeological area, which will feature a museum of Jewish history and a Jewish national park. Now, the fact that there were other peoples there in the intervening 1,400 years had to be removed physically. The American Army has also played a role in destroying the past. For 2 years, it was camped on the site of ancient Babylon. Trenches were dug through the surface, sandbags filled with archaeological material, a 2,600-year-old pavement crushed by military vehicles, and glazed bricks gouged from the famous Ishtar Gate. A British museum report on the damage was unequivocal, quote, "This is tantamount to establishing a military camp around the Great Pyramid in Egypt or around Stonehenge in Britain," close quote. As for the sale of plundered antiquities, ISIS is exploiting the inflation of the international art market by a generation of trickle-up neoliberal economics, which has seen an accumulation of wealth at the top soar to unprecedented levels. It is much easier, it seems, to call for military attacks on Syria and Iraq than to suggest shutting down the auction houses in New York, banning the sale of antiquities in London, and confiscating the grotesque fortunes of the global oligarchs who are accumulating in private collections what ought to belong in the public domain. It's important to realize that ISIS here is not just destroying these ancient these antiquities, they're pulling them up and taking them to London and selling them. The finances of ISIS are very interesting indeed in a number of ways, but one of their major sources of income is the marketing of antiquities. ISIS is a mortal threat to the people of the Middle East. It has grown in the shattered social spaces left by the violence and poverty of the neoliberal era. It is a monster created by Western imperialism. It is a form of mass psychotic rage unleashed by a world gone mad. The very last thing the region needs is further escalation in the cycles of bombing, killing, and displacement that have made ISIS possible. Now, those are the remarks, as I say, of a British archaeologist who's familiar with the situation in the region and has been active with the anti-war movement in Britain. I think he's quite right.
Yeah, current flap Rand Paul is blaming the situation there with ISIS on the warmongers in the Republican Party, which is not going down well.
Rand Paul has as his background his father's politics that said, bring all these troops home, close these 1,000 bases, and so forth. Now, Rand Paul, in his quest to become president, has abandoned the best positions that his father took up like that. But still in all, it's, there's worry that he's, that he might backslide. Huh?
Yeah, I've been trying to avoid commenting on the current campaigns.
Yeah.
I would call it Hillary and the 20 Munchkins or something.
The term clown car has been used a lot
Yeah,
from
right,
Republicans.
right.
I just wanted to make a footnote on the interesting comments and interesting reading that you did, Carl. I have a book that I have only started to read, which is from Verso Press. We have just a couple of minutes left, so let me mention that's about the whole problem of Israeli archaeology and the politicization. It's called Hollowland by a man named Eyal Weitzman, E-Y-A-L, Weitzman or Weitzman. So maybe we can return to that, perhaps after, again, I actually read it.
Sure. What's his point? What's the theme?
Well, it's a complicated argument about the politicized nature of how Israel has shaped sort of the architecture of Israel and Palestine, of course, to conform to a sort of Zionist narrative. So
Yeah, the whole thing's been so politicized.
Yeah, I mean, nothing shocking or anything, but just he goes into such detail about it that,
Yeah.
and
From
and
time
analyzes it.
immemorial, Jews
Yeah,
have
right,
lived
right.
there and so on.
Right.
And there is no Palestine.
So
There's never been a
it's
Palestine.
just to make the whole country into a kind of biblical theme park. So.
And it's whenever this topic comes up, it seems to me it's worthwhile to remember that what we're mostly concerned here is American policy and why the U.S. is doing what it's doing and the reasons that it supports the state of Israel.
Enough about us already.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 22nd week of 2015, an imperialism highest stage of capitalism edition. I'm Carl Estabrook. My discussants tonight have been David Green and Ron Szoke. Our thanks to our director and producer Jason Liggett and Dan Penno. Upcoming programs here on UPTV include Labor's Worldview Sunday at 4, and more news from outside the bubble that you can't hear elsewhere in CU. See our Facebook page for News from Neptune, and the blog newsfromneptune.com is back after a long absence. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.